In this video, we're going to cover exactly the reason behind why the Australian property market will not crash. The doomsday sayers are wrong, and it's got to do with the policymakers. We've got to cast our memories back not too long ago when COVID hit and the government introduced a massive stimulus. They were writing $25,000 checks for home builder. They've changed some recent first homeowners grants, and it's actually made housing less affordable and propped up the market. But not only that, it's actually put support behind the property market and actually kept house prices up. And we've seen this time and time again over recent times. In 2000, for example, the GST was introduced and there was a worry that the extra costs that were put on the property market and even the cost of supplies and goods and etc. was going to reduce property prices and cause a massive crash. So in response to this, the government introduced the first homeowners grant. The Howard government actually was responsible for this, as initially touted as a $7,000 grant that was given to first homebuyers. A study in 2012 actually found that this grant actually had a massive impact on the wider Australian property market. So from the year 2000, there was a strong increase in housing prices, resulting in prices nearly doubling between 2000 and 2008, well above CPI or nominal interest growth. Basically, the paper found that due to the combination of the first homeowners grant, the ability to borrow more, and limited property supply, the first homeowners grant that was introduced in 2000 did increase the median house for Australian properties by $57,000. So in other words, the government can have a massive impact on property prices, and they can basically decide if the market's going to go up and down based on some small grants and triggers that they can pull. It's been proved time and time again. So what does this have to do with a property market crash not coming, as a lot of experts have predicted, over the next while? Well, it's got to do with the government's or the ministers' vested, or I guess invested interest in the property market. So based on the recent census, it's been sort of found out that the average minister currently elected owns 2 or 3 homes and pockets $5,500 more than the average Australian. Yeah, talk about a housing crisis. The 42 members of the ministry have around $90 million tied up in the property market. That's based on a pretty conservative figure, assuming that the properties are worth less than around $937,000 as a median house price. So it could actually be more, based on the actual values. Every one of Anthony Albanese's ministers owns at least one home, with the majority opting for a home in the electorate and another in an apartment in Canberra. So each of the ministers actually own a home that they live in, so they're not going to want that price value to drop. 30% of the ministry have declared one property, 33% have 2 properties, and 26% have 3 properties, according to analysts by the Australian. This includes homes, holiday house, investment farms, land and commercial properties, but doesn't include any properties owned by partners or family members, which I think is a really important point here. It also doesn't include properties that the ministers own in trusts, in companies, or other entities. So, for example, if I lived in a home with my wife, but the property was owned in my wife's name only, it wouldn't be declared on here. So that's where, these are the properties that have actually been declared on paper that are actually owned in Anthony Albanese, Penny Wong, etc.'s individual names. Across the nation, they're talking about sort of existing thing. The crazy stat here is there's not a single renter sitting in the cabinet room, where housing policies and rental pressures and housing affordability is pitched, which is pretty wild. Like, they obviously don't have their fingers on the pulse with that. And that's obviously been a really big point for the election. But I guess back to the point of the video, the crazy thing is just the number of properties some of the ministers actually own. Indigenous Minister Linda Burley tops the government list with an interest in 5 properties. Obviously a lot less than WA Liberal Nola Mariano, who has 7 properties, which is pretty wild. But as you can see from the list, the current ministers that are serving, Tony Burke has 4, Tanya Plibersek has 4 properties. Anthony Albanese himself owns 3 properties, with the sort of average rental of $2,000 a week, Penny Wong 3, as a couple of the major ministers. The crazy thing, like even breaking down, and I guess the way that they find this data is A, the politicians have to declare it, but B, you can actually find the property ownership of people by, you can search the last name on CoreLogic RP data, and there's a bunch of public records. But interestingly, Mr. Albanese owns 2 houses in Marrickville within his Sydney seat of Grayla, and a unit in Canberra. Last year, he held 4 properties. He doubled his money when he sold another Marrickville home owned with ex-wife for $2.35 million. The couple purchased it for $1.15 million 10 years ago and offloaded it for obviously more. So if you're probably thinking, is this a brand new thing? Is this just the sort of Labor ministry? No, it's been around even with the Liberal ministry, the previous government, it was a similar situation where there was an average then of 2.05s home each across the ministry, based on just the ones that are declared. The other crazy stat that this was before the most recent federal election, but the analysts actually revealed that Labor politicians had the highest average home ownership. On the Liberal National side, there was an average of 2.09 homes each. On the Labor side, there was 2.16 homes each. The minor parties averaged. I guess the other thing with this to remember, like I said earlier, is that this doesn't include homes that's owned in a trust, that's owned in a company, or owned in a partner's name. But the fact of the matter remains that 96.6% of politicians are homeowners, compared to the declining home ownership rate in Australia, and the average home ownership rate in Australia hovered around 70%. So it's around 70% of the population compared to 96.6% of our politicians that own homes and have such a massive interest personally and politically in this industry. I think the point here is the governments and the politicians who are making the decisions have obviously a massive invested interest in the property market. They own all these properties themselves personally, and because of that, it's going to potentially influence some of their decisions. As we've seen in the past, the government has used housing policies to potentially push the market and make tweaks to it to sort of help push the market back up in times of downturns. And if the market was completely hitting the skids, they're not going to want to see their own investments and their own properties and their own potential retirement savings. A lot of people of our politician sort of generation rely on property investment and this, as future as their super. Although politicians obviously get a pretty nice retirement check when they leave. So it's pretty interesting that although there's a lot of doomsayers out there saying that there's chances of the property market crashing, I think what's potentially going to happen is, given the politicians' invested interest in this and the fact that they own so many properties themselves, why are they going to let this market crash? Even if that were to come to pass and the market were to drop 10, 15%, to stop it, all they would need to do is introduce some extra stimulus like they did with Home Builder, like they did with the first homeowners grant in 2000, where the government, although by giving this sort of stimulus, can have a direct impact on the property. And like we saw with the first homeowners grant, it increased that $7,000 grant increased property values by $57,000. So they can actually have a bunch of levers that they can pull there and things that they can do to stop the market from crashing, like people are saying. And it just looks very, very unlikely to happen. If you want to know more info on this, you can potentially look it up. I'll include links to the Australian article below. It's very interesting there that they obviously have so much and potentially will put a bit of a floor under the property market. If people are talking about these crazy drops that are potentially going to come to pass, it looks pretty unlikely given this and a bunch of other reasons. Obviously supply. Nathan did a video earlier in the week on the construction industry. You can't make more properties at the moment. It's obviously in dire straits, so it's going to put a floor there. But if you're thinking about getting in the market, if you need any help with it, obviously hit us up at huntergalloway.com.au. We'd love to help you out. And what do you think of the blow? What do you think of this situation with our politicians owning so many properties, being so invested in the property markets? It's pretty wild that they are so exposed to it and they're so across it, given the average Australian property ownership rates have been sort of dropping over the last few years. So leave a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, see you later.